Today's topic is quality assurance fit for the post-COVID era. Maybe a bit of an ambitious topic, but we'll see to what extent we manage to dive into it. Of course, it's a very different world now to 18 months ago. And initially, I think in the early stages of the pandemic, we were talking about when we get back to normal. And now we're very much talking about embracing a new normal. Quite what that looks like and what it means is still emerging, but we felt at ENQA that it was important to start that conversation. And rather than talking only about what it means for quality assurance, today's starting point is the changing practices and expectations from the key higher education stakeholders, namely institutions and students. So to help us along with that conversation, we have Therese Zhang, who is the Deputy Director for Higher Education Policy at the European University Association. And we have Jakob Gorodecki, who is the Vice President of the European Students' Union. And of course, we will then move on to what does this mean for quality assurance. And to help us with that, we have Doris Herman, who is the Managing Director of the Agency for Quality Assurance through Accreditation of Study Programs, more usually known as ACAS, one of the German quality assurance agencies. And she will talk a bit about how her agency responded to the pandemic, what have been the immediate lessons learned, and what's the forecast for the future is. After each of the presentations, we'll have time for a couple of quick questions, so do put them in the chat as the presentations are going on, and then there'll be some time for more general discussion afterwards. So without further ado, I hand over to our first speaker, which is Therese, please.
Thank you very much, Anna, and hello, everybody. Nice to see you and nice to meet you, and thank you for inviting me to speak in this webinar. I'll try to share my screen, just a second. Doesn't want to let me to, oh yes, it's here, sorry. Yes. And, yeah. Yes. You can see it, right? Just somebody nodding. Yes, I think I see that Anna is nodding. So
yes, you could maybe put it in full screen mode so that we see
it's not yet. Okay. Is that full screen now?
Perfect, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. So my talk today will focus on learning and teaching really at European universities. And to this end, I picked at first something we've been discussing as a background already in EUA's new vision for 2030, which is called Universities Without Walls, that the COVID pandemic has accelerated change and is leading to a rapid expansion in digital provision. This is really the most prominent change, let's say, we can see. We have lived through, let's say, through the pandemic, but also to a rapid expansion for research capacity to solve major societal changes. And here we're making a bet that this is likely to have a long-lasting impact in the future. Well, I guess what we could really add to that from lessons learned so far, at least from the pandemic times, is that the COVID crisis has also magnified challenges that already existed certainly in learning and teaching. And this is also where the interesting part comes to when we talk about lessons learned, is how basically we could address some of those challenges. I would like to show you this. It's actually a survey that we conducted from March to May 2020. So the survey was designed to start without the pandemic, but then the pandemic struck. So it aimed at surveying the digital capacity and digitally enhanced learning and teaching at European universities. The project is called DGHE. There is a publication available. There's a link here. And what we asked our institutions at that very beginning time of the pandemic is, what are the changes due to COVID-19 right now? What we can see is that, well, there is an increase, of course, of using virtual formats for staff meetings and exploring new tools, but also already 92% of our respondents answered that they are exploring new ways of teaching. And 75% answered that there are plans for enhancing digital capacity in the future beyond the crisis. We're also talking here about a few measures related to enhancing support, student services, online library use, etc. And also plan for updating the institution's policies on remote work. What is interesting is that among the, I think it's 300 and some institutions that answered across the HEA, 90% of them actually where for 90% of them, the majority of the students were studying mainly on campus. So that's to say just a little bit how ground shaking this was in terms of disruption into the university's activities. What we can also see is that digital assessment very quickly became a major topic. But actually, through the survey, the DGHE survey, we could see that it was already quite widespread at universities even before the pandemic struck, with a great variety, a range of variety in terms of how it was applied, of course, and also differences in terms of use, sometimes within the same institution. But for 33% of institutions, yes, it was used generally for all types of courses and throughout the institution. And we can see that 79% of institutions take digitally enhanced learning and teaching into account in their policies and measures for examination and testing, but also that there is a general agreement among them that they could basically do better. I'm sorry, but I have a little problem with my display. I cannot fully see my own slides, but that's okay. Let's try to navigate through. We conducted actually this month another survey among our members, but this time at system level. So we asked the national rectors of conferences, the national rectors conferences, what was the impact of COVID-19 crisis on universities, on learning and teaching, but from a system point of view. And we received responses from 26 higher education systems that some delivery modes, some online delivery modes, are being still offered this autumn to students, mainly blended, but also there can be a big discrepancy between institutions. It differs basically from institution to institution, and only 9 systems actually are returning to physical presence. All others are using some kind of a combination of blended, hybrid, and if there is no system-wide approach, it's handled mostly by institutions themselves. Then we ask them at system level, once again, so from a national point of view, what are the changes that are likely to remain in place beyond the crisis? So there were a lot of positive responses related to teleworking for administrative staff, for teachers, for researchers. But what we can also see is that responses are dominated really by at least partial changes in the learning and teaching provision, blended online services, infrastructures, but also staff travel to some extent. And there are still a lot of big uncertainties regarding hybrid learning. A lot of answers, not sure. Changes for testing, for the test and examinations, and also the flexible learning offer and virtual staff travel. Overall, this seems to point to a continued careful assessment of change pressures and also opportunities. Okay. So we also tried to elicit responses from the national levels through a series of interviews that we conducted with national experts from 30 HEA countries. This series of interviews took place in a broader context of trying to find out about the national initiatives on learning and teaching. So this was only one of the questions examined. And what we found out is that when we ask national experts, what are your mid to long-term plans for improving learning and teaching following the pandemic? In many countries, still, again, uncertainties prevailed because there was currently no clear plan yet, but many of them are still at mapping and evaluating phase. So through all kinds of measures, trying to find out basically what exactly are the lessons learned and how we could make best use of that in the future. One example to cite here is what the Irish National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning is doing. So they have a project called Next Steps, and I think the results will be, they are organizing an event to launch the results by mid-November, where they really try to have this sector-wide approach and discussing and being in dialogue with all kinds of stakeholders to find out what exactly indeed would come next for learning and teaching in the country. One point that seems certain, absolutely, is that attention to digital will remain, with regulatory changes needed probably for online blended or hybrid learning in some countries, and also topped up in some other countries by additional funding, by national plans, projects, etc., etc. A lot of digital and open policies indeed were found to not be fit for purpose when the pandemic hit. So that would be kind of an opportunity to address that indeed. And also, I was talking about challenges and how the crisis kind of magnified existing challenges. One of the challenges clearly identified is how to address digital skills in the future, both for teachers, teaching with digital, and also for students. This also increases awareness across the board at universities that this is not about technology. It's not, well, this is not only about technology. It's not about only infrastructure. It's not only about using online platforms, but it is mainly and firstly about pedagogy, about how to basically teach with the technology and how to embed it into daily practice. A third point I would like to mention here is that some countries cited also increased attention to academic integrity. So this was mostly related to the question of how to manage digital assessment, examination online. There was a whole discussion about proctoring, not proctoring, etc., etc. I think finally proctoring was found out not to be mainstream. However, this raised awareness towards, let's say, an increased need on what exactly is acceptable in terms of academic practice and what is not. And it's not to say that that goes down to a question between cheating or not cheating at exams, but some colleagues at universities also realized that this meant that there should be common standard and also across faculties, and also clarification throughout the curriculum and already at early stage in the curriculum of what exactly would academic integrity mean and what is expected in this regard. So I will reach some conclusions, and I'm happy also to continue this discussion with all of you. What happened during the COVID crisis at universities was clearly identified, I think, at that stage as being emergency teaching. And we received so many feedback from colleagues saying that it should not be confused with digitally enhanced learning and teaching. What we will do after the pandemic is how to address digitally enhanced learning and teaching. Not only, but also that. But we should not only think about digitally enhanced learning and teaching in terms of what we have done during the pandemic. There were some things that were good. Awareness raising in terms of delivery modes was good, but not everything necessarily was good. And we should really take the time to get some lessons learned out of this. The second point for conclusion from my side is really the broader perspective it brings for reflecting on curriculum design, delivery, and assessment. So about really the whole philosophical tenets, let's say, behind curriculum, this alignment between learning outcomes, how we deliver, how we assess, with assessment being integral part of curriculum, and also this reflection towards what we could broadly call flexibility. So the relation of learning to time, space, the pace of learning, autonomous learning, and also the added value of different and complementary approaches, be it synchronous, asynchronous, etc. And then in terms of magnifying existing challenges, there is certainly one that was clearly outlined. It was a question of equity across the board. What does flexibility exactly mean and entail? And how can we make it so to think through what would be equitable or not for any student and for all students? Third point are that clearly participatory approaches in teaching seem key to ensure active contribution and understanding also of the members of the university. I'm pretty sure that Jakob after me will also address that point. However, what we could also see clearly is that the main and structural obstacle is still a lack of recognition for teaching in careers, for teaching in the professional life of teachers, basically at the university. This considerably hinders energy, effort, and time to be spent on enhancing learning and teaching, and there is still a lot to do for teaching to get fully recognized in this regard. Just to take one example, one lessons learned from the pandemics, it's clearly time pressure. Time pressure for adapting your pedagogy under pandemic times, of course, but generally for team teaching, for instance, because that time is not recognized, is not valorized and anywhere, and you're most of the time supposed to just take it out of your, let's say, spare time. There is a question of sizing opportunities clearly to undertake structural changes in learning and teaching, but we have to realize that at the same time, there is a huge teaching fatigue at universities. People are just exhausted. And that might prompt into, let's just go back to former normal or old normal, but also people when they are academics, have left aside most of the time quite a share of their research tasks precisely to be able to cope with the additional teaching load during pandemic time. And also what we see as a new trend, especially as from this academic year, is that teachers are clearly under pressure to cater for more flexibility. So they are being asked at the same time to get back to physical teaching on campus, but at the same time to be able to basically propose a second class in parallel in terms of, you have also to cater for online needs. And also sometimes the same class is proposed on a hybrid mode, which requires also a lot of investment in terms of how to teach it and basically pedagogy. My last point here, and then I will leave it for discussion, I think, is that online learning definitely requires time and additional effort, hence support and funding. And this is something to be taken into account also at national level, that all physical teaching cannot and will probably not be, let's say, replaced by online learning, but it also requires a whole conversation at national level on how to allocate funds and how to prioritize that in policy agendas. All right, I'll leave you here, I think, and I very much look forward to further discussing this with you. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Therese, for those insights into what is going on in higher education institutions. I don't see any questions for the moment in the chat. And actually, what I had thought to ask you about, you somewhat touched on in your closing remarks, which is perhaps you might elaborate a little further on some of these tensions between the strategic wishes of connected to learning and teaching and the practical feasibility, because indeed, as you mentioned, things like flexible learning paths and hybrid learning opportunities are very difficult to or require a lot of time and investment to really achieve them well. And do you see a kind of tension between perhaps those that are more in charge of the strategic direction of learning and teaching at universities and those that are supposed to implement it?
Yes, thank you, Anna. Well, I wouldn't put it at the level of these people and those people, I think there is really a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and there is certainly a dialogue that is needed throughout the institutions, certainly, but also between them and probably also at national level, because yeah, as you said, and as somebody also very provocatively said 2 days ago in another webinar, one person's flexibility is another person's hell. It means that somebody needs to design that, and what I was trying to make as a point is that there is definitely, and we hear that so many times, there is a window of opportunity to plan ahead the post-pandemic era and really try to see how we would like to use the lessons we learned from the pandemic, but also what can we basically do better. So in a way, there is a momentum for improving learning and teaching, for thinking a bit broader, a bit like outside the box, etc. But at the same time, the people who are actually teaching at universities, I mean, so many of them are just exhausted. They just had to cope with the teaching, the emergency teaching mode, sometimes overnight since last year. And they also have to take part in that conversation about change in a way. So I think here it's less a question perhaps of people having some positions against other people having other positions than about how to build up that strategic conversation to have. In some countries, they're really trying to design project and to kind of implement a framework for this. I cited, for example, in Ireland, they're trying to have that through a project called New Steps, but it's not exactly easy, also because situation has not gone exactly back to normal. You know, it's still, the pandemic is still there. So it's still like we try to progress, but the midterm, what was seen as the midterm in May is now seen as, let's say it's now, but we now need to think about the next academic year even, because the pandemic has not stopped exactly. So I think this is really the challenge we have here, is that there is a tension between new normal, old normal, but also how can we cater for new normal, and how we define it all together. It's really the togetherness that matters.
Which is difficult when we don't even know if we're there yet. And indeed, we see across Europe cases rising in many countries, and perhaps we have some more immediate challenges to deal with before we can really emerge into a new normal. Thank you very much, Therese. We will bring you back later for the discussion, and I'd like to hand over to Jakob now for the student perspective, and I'm sure he will pick up on some of the themes already mentioned by Therese, and also others that ESU have been working on. Thank you, Jakob.
Thank you very much, Anna, and good afternoon, everybody. It's very grateful to be here, and I'm so excited to give this short presentation that actually puts the perspective from the learners in these crazy times, and actually combines not only the aspect of future of learning and quality assurance, but also very basis ground where all of the student participation comes from in this reality. And as we are representing quite a number of countries across Europe, and we are receiving signals on the basically on the situation that is happening on the universities on the national level when it comes to student engagement. So because before we are actually as students are being able to fit into the discussion on how learning is being conducted, how our programs are being made. So the core of the quality assurance that was very classical take on that just before the pandemic. Right now we are receiving the signals that actually the student representation in itself and the need for the support for the student representation and the dialogue from the learners is something that has to be very widely supported, simply because we are having quite a short lifetime being on the university, being able to fit to the discourse on our teaching. And for some of the students, of course, it's happening already for 2 years, and like the thinking before the pandemic was never an issue for them, so they don't know actually the real study way that happened before. So this is just the steps that are picturing the level of participation, and of course starting from the tokenism and starting from the participation that is simply invitation to the table, but not necessarily helping out the students towards the very common shared decision making. And we believe that students are carrying very on-ground experience of what they need when it comes to their learning, the learning delivery, and the quality assurance participation as well, because quality assurance processes for students were actually one of the biggest game changers in the past decades when it comes to being more responsible for their own learning path, for their programs, and so on. So here you can find some links after the webinar that are vital for you if you want to have a grasp on how the student participation can be boosted, and the guides for effective stakeholder involvement in that scenario. And when jumping to the quality assurance itself, it's similar when it comes to student representation that I was talking about. It's also the common process and the joint effort to have this constant exchange between the stakeholders on the local, on the institutional level. That's the level that we are mostly talking about, the daily involvement of learners. So now the big challenge in front of us is to actually how to get interest of those new students again into quality assurance procedures, how to get on board those people. So the very big effort from the institutions has to be put in bringing those people on the table and actually reflect on what they are really thinking about the learning delivery, because we have also some interesting data about Okay, so data that you actually see now, it's previous pandemic. So previously, there was the biggest barriers for students' involvement in quality assurance was the lack of information about QA. Participation was not facilitated. So also the involvement that sometimes takes 10, 15 hours was not necessarily recognized. So students were putting all the voluntary time towards quality assurance processes simply because they were most likely either, because that's the mostly cases for my experience, that if somebody was not super happy about the program that they were studying, they were trying to change it through the quality assurance processes. And the third top reason was that the processes were useless because they don't have any consequences. And it's of course, it's false. The processes were not useless, but the communication of the processes were crucial for learners to be aware that they can have an impact of the change. So that's the situation before the pandemic, the main reason of the barriers when it comes to students' involvement in quality assurance. However, the new quality assurance after pandemic and with the remote and hybrid reality is carrying much different challenges towards the students' involvement. So the situation happened and the disruption happened, and now the question is how QA can support the situation for learners currently. And the situation is like that. So planning out any feedback sessions, any ideas why maybe students are being as well as having the similar issues that maybe they are having learning fatigue, maybe they're stuck in their home, maybe they're not even the city of the study, because that was the case for more than a year, that there was simply no participation on ground on the campus because everybody was staying mostly due to economic situation in their home. One of the reasons was, for example, workload. So the workload based on the research that was conducted with the Zadar University and ESU was basically that from more than 50% of the people that were asked, the workload increased during that. And of course, it was emergency mode, but very big indicator is here. About the networks of support, we are also talking about the quality of teaching, but we were not much asking before what kind of networks of support, what kind of support the university, the institutions are giving to those students. I had a situation from my own studying when I enrolled during the COVID time, when simply people were dropping out without being able to even ask their colleagues because nobody knew each other. Of course, technically, our generation have now ultra communication between each other when it comes to groups, when it comes to chats and so on, but simply without even coming to one city, people were simply disappearing. So it's maybe worth to see actually what about the networks of support and what are the reasons of, for example, the dropouts around the universities. Then the tuition fees, so economic situations, tuition fees and scholarships, whether there were flexible modes for reducing the fee payments. Of course, it's very much connected sometimes to the budgets. It's not possible to be done from year to year, but definitely for the next budget strategies, the planning of the learning and teaching, budgeting for that activities of higher education institutions, I guess taking into consideration this variety of percentage of the different learning modes have to be taken into consideration of planning for the next years. And also, again, connected issue for the employment and for the economic situation of students. Nearly 61% of students have lost their jobs permanently or temporarily from those who are working. We're not talking about the global population, but from those who are working. So also this part, when sometimes was commented for the students that if you are working, why you are studying on a daily. However, now it changed because people simply lost their economical support. So that's another, and I really appreciate I really like the sentence actually, like flexibility that turned out to be hell for another. But maybe with using the new methods of analysis of the situation on the universities, this flexibility and possibility to working to actually provide for students might be achieved. Let's hope for that in upcoming years. And at the end, of course, there's infrastructure itself. So having a computer, having a desk, having a place to study, having a quiet place to study, and course materials were also somehow missing, especially when it comes to provision of the study materials. So also the strategies for learning and teaching should not only be translating the learning towards digital provision, but also take into consideration the accessibility of the learning materials, the facilitating the places to study, and also the access to the internet from to support those students in that cases. So that was the reality we we faced as students across Europe, and then jumping a bit shortly towards quality assurance itself and maybe its future. We are having our quality assurance experts pool as SU, and not only we are using bad word, but delegating our experts towards the reviews as a classical reviews for the programs. But we are also using the potential to have a small research on quality assurance, maybe on its future. And here I'm going to just have a few slides on how it's being perceived by the QA pool practitioners from the students. So we are discussing some key takeaways. We are organized a think tank by QA pool, and we have some key takeaways from that. And the first major point is inclusion of all perspectives in QA activities and student participation and engagement. As I have been saying, the future of quality assurance, to make it attractive for students, have to also take into consideration the recognition of this involvement on the institutional and external QA level. Not necessarily only regarding the being equal partners in the panels, that is already greatly appreciated and enjoyed in the countries where there is equal participation there, but also maybe it should be more recognized on the flexibility part of this story, or simply making it a part of QA, maybe like a curriculum, or provide the credits for that in a diploma supplement. Let's see how this development will go. The second part would be establishing a maybe label for student engagement, and of course it can be done on the different levels. It was just an idea and key takeaway from QA pool, but it's again linked to the recognition of the job. And promotion of the good practices, I think it's a very crucial one, because simply sometimes our experts, our students that are discussing with us are having a feeling of disconnection between what is actually happening very well, just the faculty nearby. So transferring those good practices within the institutions, but also between the institutions and internationally, is very crucial to establish the QA community across European higher education area. Second thing, some more forward-looking, it's the takeaways from COVID-19's impact on the conduction of QA reviews. So, of course, most of the assessment went to the digital format. And our experts seen importance of having a clear strategy and the standardized procedures, and maybe providing the abstract criteria that would assure the transparency of the process, and considering the fact that, of course, digital visits are more sustainable, but they're not providing the same data and possible to assess the programs. Maybe the hybrid way of providing some part of the reviews would be vital to do that. Third topic is a data-driven QA, forward-looking topic. Our colleagues were pointing out that at some point the real-time quality assurance possibilities, the automatically generated reports, and maybe providing the data monitoring of the student life cycle would also be possible to contribute to monitoring the needs also of students. So we can actually achieve flexibility to monitoring the learning path through maybe real-time quality assurance possibilities, for example, giving an instant feedback mechanism after classes, after courses, and not necessarily annual burdening long surveys, etc. That was one of the ideas there. In the widening scope, as I was mentioning before, on networking of quality assurance, we are also observing the internationalization, the ongoing internationalization of higher education. We are having initiatives such as European universities. We are having more joint programs being established, and still we are left with the barriers that are coming sometimes from the national regulations when it comes to cross-border quality assurance. We still see that exchanging of those practices and breaking down those barriers, cross-border barriers, will be vital for the future development of quality assurance and the higher education system, and per se situation of students later on. And at the end, the diversity perspective on learning and teaching. How can quality assurance bring the inclusion agenda forwards? And basically, since the social dimension was very longly lasting on the agenda from the past years, we still believe that quality assurance as a holistic provision to ensure the high quality of our programs, of the situation of students, of learners, could maybe at some point bring more attention to those support schemes, and of course depending on the capacity, but making the curricula more inclusive, more diverse, guaranteeing academic freedom in that sense. So that might be potential way to also develop development of quality assurance in the future. So those are 5 areas that were defined more or less by our experts, and the challenges of the future are briefly wrapped up in this slide here. So basically, recognition of students' involvement, capacity building for students that are not involved in quality assurance, because we need also those who were never involved that. And we actually believe that the earlier we can start with the students to actually share the idea of the quality assurance and why it's needed on the program level on our universities, the stronger QA community we can achieve afterwards. The quality assurance of short and flexible learning opportunities, strengthening the student pool of experts across Europe, across quality assurance agencies. Sometimes those pools are led by students, sometimes by agencies. It doesn't matter that one or other way it's better or worse. It's basically strengthening the capacity of having those pools of experts ready to conduct those reviews. Then we have a data-driven quality assurance, supporting of social dimension of education, the cross-border and internationalized quality assurance, replicating and promoting good practices, and the recognizing the learner needs in the new post-pandemic reality. So also, while currently we are still dealing partially with the digital reviews, we might very much focus on try to enhance this still uncertain reality. We are not done yet in that scenario. We are keep listening the new measures being implemented. Actually, we are very soon to publish the very short info sheet on actually like health protocols for higher education that were implemented for students across Europe. So that would be intake from my side when it comes to splitting between representation and possible future of QA thoughts that were given. And I very much thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jakob, for that very interesting presentation. It was nice to hear some of the issues that are specifically related to the impact of the pandemic, but also a number of issues that more broadly, which were sort of in progress even without the pandemic situation, and of course now the consequences of all those points converge. I wonder if I might ask one slightly speculative question, because I imagine it's too soon for you to have ESU or any of your member unions to have addressed this point. But do you think the next generation of students is going to have some very different expectations towards their education experience, their higher education experience, and different perceptions of what a quality education is? Perhaps particularly shaped by their final years at school, which have been very much disrupted by the pandemic. I wonder if there's any work in progress on this, or if you want to just speculate a little.
Speculating on that would be a gamble, I would say. But nevertheless, the tendencies of kind of achieving the rapid outcomes of whatever the newer generations are getting through is visible, either when it comes to the speed of information, the speed of instant information that people are looking for, the instant gratification of most of the actions. So I would say like the long standing education that is shaping us as citizens within our models will not fall apart in that sense. And I strongly believe that it will remain the crucial part of education to actually shape our like the new learners throughout longer time in that manner, because what actually the biggest added value that is not measurable by learning outcomes of, for example, certain one module, but widely as a holistic learning outcomes from all the programs will be actually complementary to the needs of the holistic approach of the future learners, of the future citizens. However, the tendency might shift towards the complementary courses that were not necessarily in the programs that people were choosing at the beginning. So maybe I would speculate that the sense of impatience might come from learners, that, for example, changing the programs might take 1 year, and sometimes changing the program, we were mostly changing the programs for the generation after us when we were suggesting something, for example, on the program committee, on the faculty, and so on. So I would say this education that might be provided also by universities, by institutions, and by also external providers will become relevant in complementary role of how people will be quickly looking for the certain skills and certain outcomes of education towards around the programs that will be hopefully still well established and will be shaping that future learners. That would be my speculation, as I would reiterate.
Thank you very much, Jakob. It brings me back to when I worked previously mostly on internal quality assurance, and we always discussed about the student contribution to internal QA being a very altruistic contribution, because often it would not affect them, but it would be a legacy that they leave behind for the next generations. And I think there's always scope for institutions to work on how they can make small tweaks and collect feedback in an ongoing manner in order to make some small changes that can actually still make a big difference for those that are still within the program or the educational process. To the audience, there's a couple of questions, but please do keep them coming because I will pick up on them in the discussion phase. But before we get to that, I'd like to hand the floor to Doris, who will bring this back a bit more concretely to quality assurance and talk about the experiences of her agency over the past 18 months, and importantly to give a little bit of more speculation perhaps on what the future holds. Doris, over to you. We don't hear you. I think your microphone is muted.
So can you hear me now?
We do, yes.
Excellent. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to report our experiences, but due to the fact that the German agencies also exchange on their experiences when they meet, I think many of the German agencies have similar experiences. I was asked by ENQA, what do you consider to be the most important lessons learned by your own agency from the past 18 months of dealing with the pandemic? And I can just say the answer is a quotation. Perhaps some of you know it. God, give me the patience to accept things I cannot change, the courage to change things that I can change, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Because we needed more patience during the last 18 months than I ever thought I would need. And also you need to be open and embrace change, because at the beginning of the pandemic, we really thought we just keep everything on hold and continue after the pandemic. And then we noticed that this approach does not work at all. So when the pandemic starts, we had an emergency response solution. So we definitely didn't want to change anything. So we postponed the site visit. The German Accreditation Council agreed to extend the accreditation period for the study programs. What we did were some desk-based reviews, so written format only, no online visits. And our colleagues really complained that this purely written procedures caused a lot of extra work because you have to contact the experts on every detail and forth and back. So it doesn't worked the way we thought. Like I've said, in the first months, we tried to leave everything like it is, no changes. And then we continued with virtual visits. So it has the advantage that nobody has to move. That saves costs for traveling. Of course, you lower the ecological impact. You have less travel time, and that means that our consultants can carry out more visits. You're more flexible regarding timing. And of course, you also get you get the experts involved, which usually have little time to travel, and that's also one of the chances. And of course, you have no logistical preparation anymore, or little. So this one of the chances we see in virtual site visits. And of course, we also had the chance to have creative approaches. So the universities whom we visited, for example, carried out the site visit of the institutions via a drone. It was a very interesting experience. So everybody tries to be helpful and supportive. The disadvantage of the virtual site visits is that it causes a high effort to organize and coordinate the online visits. So more support for a panel of experts is needed. You have to provide additional checklists, partially more documentation from the higher education institutions to provide evidence. The coordination of the panel as a team changes some effort. So the workload for the staff and of the agency was very high and is high. So when Therese talked about that the staff of the university is exhausted, that's the same. I think the same is true for the agencies. And depending on in which areas you're working, you have limitations of connectivity, and technology is a challenge. So we also are involved in international procedures. We worked in Africa. So if in the middle of a site visit, you don't have a connectivity anymore, then it's a real problem. And you have to find solution quickly. Of course, you have limited options to get evidence. So the infrastructure, like I've explained, of course, you can visit the premises via drone, you see some labs. But for example, in the area of engineering, the experts are very often not satisfied with the evidence they get. And you also get no whole picture of the institution as such. We also had some not so nice experiences with the dynamics of discussions. For example, if not all the panels are intercultural sensitive, and suddenly they say in Arab countries all women are suppressed, then you have a dynamic in the discussion, in the site visit, that you really cannot handle anymore. So it can become very easily very critical. And of course, like you all know, there's a lack of socializing and intercultural exchange. Also for the experts, we made the experience that they were quite professional, so that's not the point. But yeah, you can see sometimes that the experts are not that motivated to carry out several online visits. So they tell us, yes, once a year I'm willing, but I'm not willing to participate in 2 online visits per year, because their intrinsic motivation to exchange with colleagues in the panel, but also from the university, that cannot be fulfilled. It's lacking, and networking is lacking. So I suppose that it will be harder to find experts. And of course, sometimes even the people, the experts who are very ambitious and very open for online learning on all these ICT tools, they say, please not again another online training or another online site visit. I'm fed up with online. Yeah, so and I think depending on the higher education where you work at, you also have a lack of understanding, and that impacts the assessment. So if a German university professor works at another German university, it may work, but suddenly if you have little intercultural knowledge and you work in an African context or an Asian context, it's the assessment may be wrong or too harsh or unfair, something like this. So lessons learned. I think if you want to carry out online visits, you really have to be focused on the structure, and the preparation effort by the agency is much higher. You need strict communication rules and a very strict moderation during the on-site visits. Otherwise, you cannot structure it criteria. You don't have time to address all the criteria and so on. Technical support is needed, so I think everybody who offers webinars or trainings on visits needs a technical support somehow, and in some cases it's not possible, so it might happen that you lose one of your experts in the middle of the site visit. We implemented new channels for experts to exchange, so WhatsApp groups, that worked very well. But what we also noticed is, of course, the real life is taking place behind and beside the scenes. So suddenly the sun comes in during a site visit, or the dog disturbs the site visit. So you have all this, what's taking place at the same time. What we noticed is that whole day schedules nearly do not work. Everybody is completely exhausted after 3 full days of online visits. So we try to have shorter days, but this means you need more days, and then the availability of the experts cannot be guaranteed. So how to organize the site visits, and more breaks are needed. What we also noticed is when we worked abroad, language suddenly becomes very crucial. And in the moment when, when the interpretation does not work because due to connectivity or because the interpreter is not very professional, then you just cannot only stop the online visit or to find another solution, another interpreter, but you cannot continue. The universities often provide videos as an additional source of information. That is good, but what do they show in the videos? I mean, do they only show the bright side of the infrastructure, or how close are the videos to reality? We also had some issues with data protection. For example, universities wished, or we noticed that during a site visit, they have some recording, but our experts did not sign that they agree, and you have this law on data protection. So this can become an issue. And depending on the cultural background, also problems can become difficult to discuss online. Face-to-face, if your colleagues sit in front of you, it's much easier. And that refers to the next aspect, intercultural aspects can become a problem. What we noticed is all, but the report in the end is no problem, so that works well. And like I've said, we are in a transition phase, so I cannot predict what will come up. But I think for the agencies, there are some crucial questions. How will the higher education change as a result of the pandemic? Because whatever the higher education institutions will do with online teaching, micro-credentials, and so on, will have a severe impact on the work of the agency. And of course, the higher education institutions, there's always a pressure on QA agencies to lower the costs and to lower the effort. And due to this online mode, we get weekly requests from higher education institutions. Please make it cheaper, but our effort is the same, so we get stuck. What the whole system has to discuss of external QA is a site visit the gold standard. So how much validity does external QA really need? And of course, there's a question, can mutual trust be created online? Or do you have different procedures for different higher education institutions? For example, if you already know the institution quite well, then you can switch to online procedures. If you haven't worked there before, then it has to be a face-to-face visit. Third area of activity is how will the reviewers engage on the long run. So what is the benefit from I don't know, 10 online visits? And does it mean that the agencies will lose experienced experts in the middle run? And of course, ENQA and also the German Accreditation Council and our Accreditation Commission, they said, okay, we expect you to go back to the face-to-face visits because otherwise we don't accept the outcomes. But is it really the way ahead to say, no, you have to be there and online visits are not reasonable and trustworthy anyhow? And do ENQA and the ENQA consider online visits as second-class visits? How will they behave? So I tried a kind of weather forecast. I think it's difficult to predict what will come up because we notice two tendencies. One is more. We want to have more online visits and I don't know, more online trainings, and the others is less. So universities and experts contact us and say we want to have less online. And what is the way ahead? I don't know. But I think what AQUAS will try is to provide more online trainings for experts and for higher education institutions to start the procedure. We hope we will develop more models, hybrid models for international reviews, so an online visit, and then a delegation will visit higher education institutions to gain more evidence. What is needed are new instruments for assessment of all these e-formats, which have been provided by the higher education institutions in the last months. And of course, there's a chance for international exchange. And I think the outreach of all the activities of ENQA and also of our agency, it's much broader than before, and that's a chance. Problematic can be the pressure on costs, and that will have an immediate impact on the funding of the agencies because many German agencies have to charge. They are not funded by the state, but they have to charge the institutions. So when they put pressure on costs, we will get into trouble. We will most likely lose some of our experts. And the question is how much agency staff is needed. So how much do we really need? Do we need less? Do we need more? And what kind of qualification does the agency staff have to have? And I think all the agencies have to improve their technical infrastructure to be able to carry out all this online conferences and so on and so on. And problematic aspect can be fraud. I'm waiting for the first case when you noticed as an agency after a half a year or 1 year that the university has cheated you. And how do we deal with this? So I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Doris, for that interesting input. And I think some of your your considerations for the questions that external QA will have to address in the future are very very pertinent for today's discussion. I want to pick up first of all on a question from the audience around some of the questions being raised about the validity of the educational outcomes for the so-called COVID generation, those going through higher education at the moment. And I put this question to all speakers. Do you see that as a problem in the spheres that you're working in? And is there a role for quality assurance in addressing these concerns about the validity of the educational outcomes for those currently going through higher education?
May I come in?
Please do, yes.
I don't have an answer on this, but I work with an institute for statistics who is specialized on tracer studies, and I told them, please don't focus on tracer studies. Try to measure learners' progression and the level of competencies, because we urgently need an answer on this. What was it's quite clear that COVID caused a disruption, but we don't know what we can expect. And did the universities really manage to provide online lectures which heal the problem, or is there a lack of competencies? I don't know.
Anna, I think it's a very good question, but a very tricky one. And first of all, I think we perhaps we need to indeed think about this, but on a holistic level, because we should not necessarily assume that because of the pandemic, the outcomes are of less quality, let's say. There is one slide I didn't show, but it was also one of the questions of that survey, which shows that actually success rate, it's the contrary, dropout rates were slightly lower during the pandemic, but also in some countries, apparently there is some evidence through statistics that success rates were not necessarily lower during the pandemic. So I think it's not that obvious that when asking the question, we take it for granted that it might be of less quality, but I would not necessarily take it for granted. That's what I mean. I think we need a bit of mapping the situation and what exactly has happened for those generations. This being said, at least last year, so in spring 2020, it was very clear under the emergency teaching mode that for many classes, for many courses, and within many curriculum, the question was less about how do I do constructive alignment? So how do I assess, how do I deliver compared to learning outcomes for a program that were defined well before the pandemic, then basically how can I cope with that situation? So yeah, I think we lack a bit, I think I at least lack a bit of distance to fully evaluate that situation. But I very much liked Dora's comment that it's really the process. Learning is a path, it's a journey. So I would perhaps less focus on, is it of less or of better quality in terms of student outcomes, and what did it mean for the learning curve, for the learning gains they may have had. So I do not actually have an answer immediately to your question, but I think there are still many elements we need to fully examine in order to make up our minds in terms of how we take it forward for QA.
Doris, you have your hand up, and then I come to you, Jakob, if you'd like to contribute on the question.
I think that's a severe situation for the learners, because in Germany, many schools were closed for quite a while. And that means that the future students will for sure have a lack of competencies and how to deal with this. But without assessing what you can expect, what competencies the future students and the actual students have, you cannot act. I think data are urgently needed.
Jakob, what's the response from the student representative?
I'm sorry, because I got a bit lost when it comes to the question itself, because I got somebody which came into the room and caused a bit disruption. If you might repeat the short question when it comes to the outcomes.
Yes, we were talking about concerns raised in some quarters that there might be concerns around the validity of the educational outcomes for the COVID generation. And do you see this as an issue, and what is perhaps the role for quality assurance in addressing that?
I strongly feel that none of the learners that had to go through this has to, at some point, suffer when it comes to the I mean, this situation caused so many disruptions when it comes to the stability that some faculties, some learning paths that students were undertaking indeed were suffering more than the others. So depending on the study fields, we have examples that, for example, colleagues from the departments that were mostly around getting education around the lectures or around the computer work when it comes to IT department and so on, were quite happy and positively assessing the outcomes that they received during that time. So this is also the division between what learners received on that. But the final outcome would be that the whole generation came through that. And I think it's going way beyond the higher education and quality assurance, in that sense that it's a responsibility of the whole population, of the whole society, to kind of incorporate this missing, if there are any missing outcomes, and not necessarily they are, as Teresa was saying. So that would be my take. That's I think that's going way beyond, and the generation as a whole will be somehow affected, and we don't know yet how, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think, and this echoes some of the comments now being made in the chat around courses and programs that have a significant element of practical learning, those that are around technical and vocational education as well, that these may well be more significantly impacted than other programs. But also to pick up and just to verbalize some of the other comments around the informal learning that this generation of students is going through, the ability to adapt, the ability to respond to crisis situations, self-organization. These are some of the comments being made in the chat, that there is what some students may miss out on sort of formal educational outcomes. They're building other competencies in the meantime. I want to address a slightly different topic now, and well, still obviously on quality assurance, and that's around of course, the role of internal quality assurance, because one of the principles of the QA framework in the European higher education area is that the primary responsibility for quality assurance lies with the institution. And I wonder, Doris, whether you've seen in the outcomes of the reviews that your agency is conducting, whether you see already evidence of institutions changing their practices over the course of the year. Of course, there will have been some emergency responses as we talk about them, but do you see also evidence of more long-term or medium-term changes to the way that internal quality assurance is arranged that perhaps responds to some of the issues that have come up over the past year?
Thank you, Anna, for the question, but I think that's really difficult to answer. What we saw is that the universities switched more to online tools, so online surveys, but that was also a tendency before. So for me, it's difficult to assess if this is really will have an impact in the middle run on the internal QA.
Would one of the other speakers like to come on this? Teresa, I know it's not your primary area of work at the moment, internal quality assurance, but is it something that is being discussed?
Yes, actually, I think EUA published was it last year or this year? Yeah, this spring, a report on, I'm putting the link in the chat box, on internal quality assurance and in terms of COVID. And that was, oh, well, I see my colleague Elena Kilan from UA is also in the room. So, so yes, there was a exploration of that question, let's say, led by the UA Secretariat through a focus group earlier this year. So you can also perhaps read some of the interesting findings in there. My overall feeling, without going into detail, is that the same challenge that was posed to other university activities was also posed to internal QA, which evolved mainly around flexibility and equality of treatment across the board. You know, so I guess it was kind of also a stress test in a way for internal QA, how to be agile enough to cope really with all the changes, and agile enough or flexible enough to do it on spot, like literally overnight. Another point I would like to mention is that actually what we found out in the course of our work at the UA on learning and teaching is that in many countries, learning and teaching is really closely, intimately embedded with QA in terms of structures at university to take that in charge. So there are QA units that also serve as learning and teaching support unit and things like that. So a lot of work has also been done by colleagues who are also in charge of internal QA in terms of supporting teachers, in terms of providing for resources and tools, and et cetera, and this should not be forgotten. For the rest, I'll just refer to the report. I think there were a few interesting findings as well. But the main point I would raise here is really that increased need for flexibility and agility across the board.
Jakob, is this something that's being discussed in the QA pool?
Not really. I have an answer for that question. Regarding the internal quality assurance, I think from the perspective of students, it was more. I mean, the bigger issue is more that I was mentioning at the beginning of the presentation, when it's actually the internal quality assurance on the faculty level, on the university level, was strongly relying on active people on the ground, and from the discussions, not that we have a data on that, but simply like maintaining the same level of participation over along with the teaching fatigue, to also get into the process and somehow be involved in the internal quality assurance processes was kind of hard to achieve from the learners, from people involved before in that. So on that note, definitely the internal QA might suffer, and that might have an implication on students' involvement. So apart from the support for the teachers, from people like working on QA, like in the QA offices, in the learning and teaching offices on the departments, I think the efforts that are need to be taken soon will to like bring back the student body to this mindset of participating in this internal quality assurance discussions. So that would be the main issue that I see, but not necessarily widely researched by us.
Thank you. And I see that Therese, your colleague Eleanor, is posting a few of the key points from the EUA study in the chat. So if you're interested in that topic from the audience, then please do have a read. Doris, there's one more question I'd like to address that picks up on a couple of your points in your presentation about the experts that we use to conduct external quality assurance. And there have been plenty of discussions, as you picked up on, around their abilities and willingness to conduct external QA in an online format. But looking a bit beyond that, even when we move back potentially to physical site visits, do you feel that there's going to be a need for a different kind of expert to respond better to some of the changes that are happening in higher education in terms of an increased offer of digital education, more programs being offered in hybrid format? I realize this again is speculation rather than concrete information, but do you think that agencies will be looking at the profiles of their experts and thinking about how to either recruit other experts or to train the existing ones to respond to some of the changes that are ongoing?
Thank you, Anna, for the question. I would like to say something in advance. First of all, the effort to find experts during the pandemic situation is much higher. So my colleagues complain that usually they have to write, I don't know, 4 or 5 emails. Now they have to write 10 because everybody says, I'm so busy with online teaching and learning and with all the changes in my life. Please leave me alone. And QA is not that important. It's an additional value. Huh? So they focus on their own teaching and learning, and they are not always available. So we can be happy if experts still are committed to contribute to these processes. And what I know from experiences before the pandemic was that we really had difficulties to find experts who are very familiar with e-learning, e-teaching and learning. So to exaggerate a little bit, I can tell you the names of the experts. It's and when we were searching for some of the experts, more and more people have experiences with this, but they are harder to find because it's not on their homepage. So if you check websites for experts or you get their CVs, it's not included. So sometimes you don't know. Then you focus on the experts who come from the area of pedagogy, but you cannot use them for all procedures and so on. So it's really hard to find. We would like, that should be one of the characteristic of experts. It's included in website and CV so that it's transparent what they know and what they don't know. But at the moment we are lost.
Thank you. Jakob, please.
For that, I have a quite interesting intake, and of course, it's not gonna be elaboration on the type of an expert in that sense. First of all, what might change and what might be adapted will be like recruitment procedures and trainings for the experts that will be given to the possible digital reviews when it comes to the mode of how they will be delivered. And the interesting input that I'm sharing now with everyone is actually that I think that was shared also by you, Anna, when it comes to the poster that we had on ENQA conference. So yeah, we asked our experts regarding 4 different competences. So we 4 different groups of competences. So regarding social competences, knowledge and expertise, self-competences and methodological competences, on how they would assess the importance of the certain competences in the in the physical reviews comparing to the digital reviews. And it turned out that in some cases there was a strongly feeling that this is more important in digital. For example, skills like effective communication, active learning, IT skills is quite obvious, but also flexibility, self-motivation, time management was put as those competences that were being assessed as more important digitally. So because of the reviews were, for example, conducted over the whole day in a different time frame over Teams, the calendar arranged, the arrangement of the calendar, the management of all emails, all the basically data that was about to be delivered. So, and effective communication as well, because in the digital reviews, we had feedback that most of the interviews were kind of conducted in a way that the questions were pre-prepared. There was a scenario because the time efficiency of the review digitally is going very much in a more strict way comparing to the physical interaction. If review is going to the panel and meeting real people, the discussion sometimes goes around. There is different emotions, different feelings in the room when having an interaction with the real people in the real room. And when it comes to the analysis of what we actually hear over Zoom, as we are talking here right now, it's as well the same skill that participants of this webinar are requiring now. They're having now the different skills after 1.5 year of listening to Zoom, I think, comparing to what we would all have before. So yeah, those skills were assessed as more relevant for possibly future skills of experts. And of course, that can fit into the way how people will be trained to do that. So on the responsible of agencies, how the training for the new expert will be delivered.
Of course, the issue being that many of those competences are very difficult to train for, and are something that you develop along the way as you gain experience. But I think definitely there's some food for thought regarding the experts that will be conducting QA in the future. We are very quickly running out of time, so I'd like to give my three panelists the opportunity to for a minute each or so, if they would like to make any concluding remarks, any reflections on what they've heard from their colleagues, any lasting impression that they have from the discussion today, if there's anything that you would like to raise that you haven't had an opportunity to do so. There's a reluctant silence.
Shall I come in? Yeah, I think what we can do is to embrace change and to say, where are the chances if we do something? So that you don't have to travel for short-term trainings, which last half the day, and you don't have to travel through whole Europe or whole Germany, is a chance. So I think you can, you have a wider outreach, that's a chance. And of course, you can exclude from experts. If I would, you can include other experts. So if I would tell a German university, for the money you pay, you have to pay additional travel costs for somebody from the US who is able to talk German, but you have to pay the flight costs, and the university would tell me, Ms. Herman, you're completely nuts, but now with this online format, perhaps you can include somebody from the US, from Africa, from other European countries more easily, and that's a chance for have a better international exchange. Thanks.
Thank you, Doris. Any other comments?
Yes, yeah, just very quickly from my side, you know, on our side, when we talk about the future of learning and teaching in post-pandemic times, it's interesting because I have the feeling sometimes we are having a parallel discussion to what is being discussed here in terms of how to lead the visit in the future, etc. What would be in the future, not digital learning, but what would be the real added value and how we would see on-site teaching? That's the question that popped up in my context very much. And perhaps that's the question we have to ask ourselves, perhaps less in terms of how would we organize online visit or how, you know, how to train experts to do so, but what would be the actual real added value of on-site visits and how you can basically juggle with this, you know, synchronous, asynchronous, but also how can those two modes be complementary and work together in a way. So yeah, that would be my reflection perhaps for today. And then I actually very much, I find what Jakob said before that quite inspirational. You know, we all need some kind of skills training in this regard, I think, because it's not only a question of skills, actually, it's a question of mindset, really, how to address this new reality in the future. So yeah, a lot of food for thought. Perhaps I'll leave it here for today at least. Thank you.
Thank you. Jakob, any final remarks?
Not much of a final remarks. It's a privilege of ending the final remarks to just thanking for discussion that happened here basically, and just when it comes to, yeah, my final message would be to everyone that actually hear the discussion is to, because we cannot find out and find one solution on how to get people on board again, and what just simply we need right now, I think, when it comes to young people, when it comes to learners across our higher education institutions and education, is just simply to look inside towards the needs, so to look more deeply into the needs of those people, because simply those learners are kind of, we cannot look the same, right? So maybe open up. This is the perfect time to open up towards the needs, towards the things that we might never actually acknowledge when we were just going with the flow from the previous major crises that happened 12 years ago. We had a quite lucky 12 years, I'm always saying, when the second one happened. So so I'm saying it was a sense of just being driven in one direction without major changes. That was the sense of being maybe sleepy. So just open up towards the needs, open up towards the reality that was not with us, and just use it into the positive direction. Because if we're gonna also get into the mood of saying all the time what terrible happened without taking the message forwards, we're gonna stay with that until 2030. So I don't think we would like to go with that. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Jakob, for ending on this positive note. I think from my perspective, what we've seen from the discussion is we're also almost in a sort of awkward transition phase where we're over the immediate reactions, and we have a number of very practical lessons that have been learned, but still sort of feeling our way as to what this really means for changes in the future, and what will be permanent changes and what not, and also what the interplay is with other factors, because of course we can't address any of these issues as being caused by the pandemic alone. Many of the things that we are discussing around site visits, around digital learning and teaching, about whether to measure learning outcomes or learning gains. These are discussions that were happening already pre-pandemic, but have perhaps been accelerated by the events of the past 18 months. I think what we have demonstrated is that institutions and agencies have a capacity to change, and perhaps a capacity to change more quickly than we previously realized. I think probably higher education and QA doesn't exactly have a reputation as being a very fast acting sector. They can be quite big ships to try and turn around. And I think we can use the momentum that is gathered and embrace that flexibility as we move forward. So with that, I'd like to close. I'd like to thank our speakers, Therese, Doris and Jakob, for their insights, their willingness to contribute today, their willingness to speculate, because I realize that a lot of this is speculation. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank the audience for contributing in the chat, and also to my colleagues that are helping to make everything happen in the background. I would just like to briefly advertise two further events that may be of interest to you. There's another ENQA webinar happening at 10 o'clock Brussels time tomorrow, in which we will share some innovative practices from members and affiliates on two topics. One around using the results of thematic analysis, and one around communication and transparency and external quality assurance. So that promises to be very interesting. If you haven't registered and would like to, please do contact the Secretariat to do so. And finally, the QA event of the year also takes place online this year. That is, of course, the European Quality Assurance Forum, which is on the 18th to the 19th of November. Registrations for that are still open until the 1st of November. So please do take a look at the EUA website to find full details about that. And with that, I thank you all again for your participation, and I wish you a very pleasant rest of afternoon and evening. Thank you. Goodbye.